Bloodbath at Goingsnake. From the inside of the courtroom, juror George Blackwood saw the grim-faced posse heading for the courthouse door. He also saw they were armed to the teeth. The posse was coming inside to get Zeke Proctor. Near the doorway, White Soot Beck, a member of the posse with a score to settle, shoved aside an Indian policeman and stormed into the courthouse. Inevitably, somebody fired a shot, and then everything broke loose. White Soot pulled down on Zeke Proctor, but Johnson Proctor, Zeke's brother, grabbed White Soot's weapon and took one barrel full in his own chest. Johnson, mortally hurt, still hung on to the shotgun, forcing the second shot down toward the floor. Zeke was hit in the foot by a couple of buckshot, but his brother had saved his life. Zeke's defense counsel, Mose Alberti, was hit with 2 shotgun rounds and went down dying. As gunfire roared in the log schoolhouse, men on both sides began to fall. Nobody knows how many men Zeke shot, but he produced a weapon from somewhere, probably a revolver, and the range was point blank. He took shelter in a convenient chimney corner, which gave him at least a little cover. At the door, Sam Beck stepped in front of White Soot, and somebody cut him down. Then White Soot dropped, and more men fell in agony as weapons roared inside and outside the courthouse. The Beck faction quickly realized they were badly outgunned. They scattered then, those who could still stand, and the firing and shouting died away. As the smoke blew away, the ground was littered with bodies. 4 corpses lay in a welter of blood inside the schoolhouse door. 3 more lifeless bodies were sprawled outside. A few paces away lay another corpse, and a badly wounded man lay moaning behind the building. And another was dying in a nearby clump of bushes. Judge Sixkiller had 2 buckshot in his wrist, and lawyer Alberti lay near Johnson Proctor, both men elderly and unarmed. One juror had a hole in his shoulder, and several others also had wounds, most of them minor. Close by, in Mrs. Whitmire's house, Deputy Marshal Owen was dying, gasping that he had tried his best to hold back the Becks. Zeke Proctor was being held and charged for the murder of one of Sam Beck's kin. Proctor never meant to kill Polly Beck, but he was after blood. He wanted to put a bullet into Jim Kesterson, the white man with whom Polly lived at Hildebrand's mill. When Zeke confronted Kesterson, both men reached for their guns, and Zeke was a lot faster. Trouble was, as he squeezed off around, Polly threw her body in front of Kesterson to shield him, and the bullet meant for Kesterson killed her. Then Kesterson fled for his life. What happened to Zeke Proctor can only be understood against that background in the bloody canvas of the Civil War. Like most of the tribes, the Cherokee were split between North and South. A majority supported the Confederacy, but some adhered to the North. Zeke chose the North, enlisting in July of 1862 and serving 3 years in an outfit called the Indian Home Guard. It is known that he was wounded at least once in the fighting. Old friendships between Cherokees serving the Union, as Zeke did, and others of his tribe wearing the Confederate uniform crumbled, and the seeds of post-war troubles were sowed. Zeke was a farmer like most of his people, and served as a layman in his district. Zeke's parents christened him Ezekiel, an appropriate Bible name. He came of ancient English stock, son of a family that had seen the shores of the Americas in the early 1600s. But he was also a half-blood Cherokee. At least in his youth, Zeke had a distinct fondness for strong spirits and loud roistering, and for shooting up saloons. By 1890, he owned 3 farms, 10 structures of various kinds, a large stock of produce, and a sizable collection of domestic animals. In addition to his thriving farms, he may have maintained more than one wife, but in those days polygamy was neither uncommon nor unlawful in the Cherokee Nation. A prosperous and respected citizen, he would not have ended up on the wrong end of the law had it not been for the deep family pride all Cherokees knew. The bitter dregs of civil war, divisiveness, and anger, and the deep-seated chasm between the Kituwas and others in the Cherokee Nation. Although Zeke hadn't intended to hurt Paulie, once the Cherokee justice system took jurisdiction of his case, the fat was in the fire. There were problems from the start. If the Becks were numerous and influential, so were the Proctors. The two families had taken leading parts in Cherokee government. They had been close once too, but the Civil War had changed some of that friendship. The clash between the Proctors and Becks, between traditionalist Kituwas and white man's law, was further aggravated by a jurisdictional dispute between Indian and U.S. courts. Zeke himself was unquestionably Cherokee, and Kesterson was Cherokee by adoption. Because that was so, the U.S.-Cherokee Treaty seemed specifically to solve the question of who had the right to jurisdiction. The judicial tribunals of the Cherokee Nation shall be allowed to retain exclusive jurisdiction in all civil and criminal cases arising within their country, in which members of the nation, by nativity or adoption, shall be the only parties, or where the cause of action shall arise in the Cherokee Nation, except as otherwise provided in this treaty. It was hard to find a judge or prosecutor who wasn't somehow related to the Proctors. The regular judge was disqualified because he was related to the Proctors, to both sides for that matter. So also was a second. At last, Chief Downing appointed Black Haw Sixkiller as judge, and Sixkiller quickly set about getting the case to trial. Everybody was expecting trouble, so the case was scheduled to be heard on April 15th in the Whitmire Schoolhouse rather than the Goingsnake District Courthouse. The school building near what is now Christie, Oklahoma, was farther away from Beck country than the courthouse. Besides, the school was a solid log building, and it had only one door and fewer windows than the courthouse. It would therefore be easier to defend in case of trouble. Because the Proctor family was large and well-connected, and Zeke was a prominent Kituwa, the Beck family was not sure their idea of justice would be done. And so, on April 11th, Jim Kesterson and a party of Becks rode into Fort Smith to hedge their bets. The U.S. magistrate issued a warrant for Zeke's arrest, apparently on the fanciful notion that, in spite of the clear language of the treaty, the United States had jurisdiction over offenses against white people. And Kesterson was white, adopted Cherokee or not. The magistrate also issued warrants for 7 other men, including Judge Sixkiller, and added a bizarre touch by issuing warrants for the entire jury. He also issued some very peculiar instructions to the 2 unfortunate deputy marshals sent to serve the warrants. They were to wait until the results of the Cherokee trial were known, and if Zeke was convicted, they were to return to Fort Smith without taking any action. In case of an acquittal, however, their mission was to arrest Zeke and the others named in the warrants and return to Fort Smith. On the day of the trial, the makeshift courthouse was jammed with people, many of them Proctor partisans armed to the teeth. Outside stood a dense crowd of Cherokees, eager to hear the proceedings, or to be handy in case of trouble. Among them were a number of Beck partisans who, armed, wearing twigs of wild plum blossom in their hats as badges of support. Inside, the court clerk sat near Judge Sixkiller. Zeke's lawyer, Mose Alberti, sat on the judge's right. Zeke sat next to Alberti. Tom Wallingstick, one of the guards, stood close to Zeke. At about 11 in the morning, a posse appeared, mostly Beck partisans, led by Deputy U.S. Marshals J.G. Peavy and J.G. Owens, both well-respected and well-liked in the Indian nations. Owen ordered his posse men to stay out of the courthouse until the verdict was reached, but Owens quickly lost control. The posse men dismounted, formed a rough column of 2s, and pushed through the crowd toward the door. Other armed Beck partisans in the crowd outside joined them. Nobody doubted they meant business because they were cocking their weapons as they came. In the lead was Surrey White, Sut Beck, cradling his double-barreled shotgun. Once the posse men were inside the schoolhouse, the bloodbath began. The Becks took terrible casualties. Black Soot, Samuel, and William Beck were dead or dying. So were William Hicks, Jim Ward, George Selvage, and Riley Woods. White Soot Beck was seriously hurt, although he would survive, and Isaac Van had a bad elbow wound. In addition to Johnson Proctor, the Proctors lost Andrew Pallone, a Civil War veteran of the Pea Ridge fight. Several others, both partisans and bystanders, had suffered more or less minor wounds. Zeke's only wound was the buckshot from White Soot's weapon. He could still fight and ride. After the bloodbath, Widow Whitmire got her teenage boys to hitch the family mules to a wagon and began to collect the dead, dying, and wounded. The bodies of those killed were conveniently arranged on the Whitmire front porch, so their kinfolk could easily collect them. The wounded were gently carried inside to be cared for by Mrs. Whitmire and others. On the next day, the jury reconvened at Captain Arch Scraper's house nearby to finish the job. Zeke was there too, announcing that he would not give up his right to be present at his own trial. Wounds and all, the jury deliberated long enough to acquit Zeke and then intelligently depart in some haste, on the sound theory that Fort Smith would send more marshals or more Becks would appear, or both. James Huckleberry, the U.S. Marshal, furious over the carnage, sent a 21-man posse down to Goingsnake. But by the time the lawmen arrived 2 days later, nearly everybody had scattered. The deputy marshal in command, Charles F. Robinson, wisely decided not to launch a fruitless pursuit into the hills and thickets of the district. Robinson had brought along two doctors, Julian Fields and C.F. Pierce, who set to work to do what they could for the wounded. Though wounded, Zeke was nowhere to be found. Escorted by a group of nearly 50 heavily armed Kituwas, he was headed for the toughest and most inaccessible parts of Cherokee lands. Judge Sixkiller was also gone to the tall timber, as were most of the jurors. In spite of Robinson's intelligent decision not to pursue Zeke, it took time for all the bad blood to die away. For a while afterwards, great tension existed between the Cherokees and anybody who was or looked like a deputy marshal. There was some gunplay and some deaths, and even Proctor family members attributed some of the killings to Zeke. One thing was clear: no marshal, no matter how efficient or courageous, was going to catch Zeke. Inevitably, Zeke was indicted for murder and the death of Deputy Marshal Owens, charged with some 20 others, including those of the judge and members of the jury. In the flowery, verbose, tedious legal language of the age, Zeke, with a certain pistol, then and there loaded and charged with gunpowder and 20 leaden bullets, then and there feloniously and wilfully, and of his malice aforethought, did shoot and discharge, and that with leaden bullets aforesaid, out of the pistol aforesaid, then and there by force of the gunpowder shot, and sent forth, as aforesaid, Jacob Owens, in and upon the left side of him, and on ad nauseum, including allegations of aiding and abetting murder against a whole host of other Cherokees. The curious reference to a weapon loaded with 20 rounds remains obscure. In any case, Zeke would not be tried again. Hiding out in the hills of Cherokee country, escorted and protected by Kiowa partisans and kinfolk, he would remain free until at last some of the old bad blood had died away. And so peace of a kind returned to Goingsnake district. But it did not include Zeke Proctor and White Soot Beck. For many years each man watched his back, kept his weapons close, wondered what lay hidden in the woods up ahead. Each man was carefully watched over by his kinfolk. As a testament to the support he held at home, Zeke became Cherokee senator from Goingsnake district in 1877 and was elected sheriff in 1894. In the autumn of 1891, Zeke was appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal. He rode for tough, indefatigable federal judge Isaac Parker. All the law there was west of Fort Smith. Marshalling must have agreed with Zeke, who knew every trail and hideout in the nations. He renewed his contract in February of 1895. Zeke Proctor died at home at 77 years old in February of 1907, not of hot lead or cold steel, but of pneumonia. He's buried in the Proctor family plot in Johnson Cemetery, 5 miles west of Siloam Springs. His monument is the tallest in the cemetery, and that is as it should be. Respectable in his old age, Zeke had never entirely forsaken the old ways. His last words, his granddaughter said, were, "Feed the boys good." He meant the outlaw Wycliffe brothers, then lying low in Zeke's barn. But before Zeke died, and long years after the rains had washed away the clotted blood outside the Whitmore schoolhouse, White Soot Beck and Zeke Proctor finally met in the land office at Tahlequah, and after all the years stood face to face at last, two old and mortal enemies. Finally, White Soot Beck spoke. "Proctor," he said, "we're too old to fight, but I'm game, and I know you are too. I'll walk away if you will." And then, without saying more, the two tough, proud old men turned and left the land office by different ways. The feud was over, without formality, without fanfare, without speeches. Nobody had backed down, nobody had won, nobody had lost, which was how the long feud should have ended.